my name is Julia, and in today's lesson we're going to learn how to make handmade pizza dough at home. So it's a really simple recipe. You might already have the ingredients in your cupboard. If not, it only has 6 ingredients. If you follow along with me, we can do it together. I'm going to mix all the ingredients and knead the dough in real time. If you've never made pizza at home before, it can be kind of intimidating to make bread dough, especially when it has yeast in it. But it's actually quite simple and relatively easy. So this lesson should give you a good idea on how to make a successful dough. So all you're gonna need is a big bowl. You don't need a mixer or any special machine. A spoon to mix some of the ingredients. A measuring cup, this is a 1 cup measuring cup. And then some measuring spoons. Something to measure out water. This is clear, so it works really well. For ingredients, really important ingredient is yeast. This is what allows the dough to rise up and then to get all nice and airy, which is what you want in a good pizza dough. You need salt. I like to use kosher salt, but if you only have table salt, that will work as well. A little bit of sugar. This is white granulated sugar, but you can use brown sugar or cane sugar if that's what you have. Oil. This recipe calls for olive oil, but you can also use canola or vegetable oil. And then you need all-purpose white flour. And then the final ingredient is water, which you can just get from the tap. So, something to keep in mind for this recipe is that the dough will need to rise for 1 hour before you bake it. So if you're making pizza for dinner, make sure that you start with enough time to allow for 1 hour of rising. Alright, so before you get started, make sure you've washed your hands with soap. After we mix the ingredients together, we're going to take the dough out of the bowl and use our hands to mix it at the end. So you want to make sure you have nice and clean hands before you get started. The first ingredient we're going to want to measure out is your water. So in a yeasted bread dough, you need to have warm water to mix the yeast with. So that's usually the first step in any yeasted bread dough recipe, is mixing the yeast with some water. If you get your water too hot, then the yeast might die and it won't be active in your dough, which means that your bread dough won't rise. So what I like to do is run the tap water till it gets warm, and then I measure it out, and just to make sure it's not too hot, I just dip a finger in the water. It should feel slightly warm on your finger, but not hot at all. So this recipe calls for 3/4 of a cup of water. So I'm going to leave the water in this container. And then the recipe calls for 1 envelope of active dry yeast. So sometimes at the store, the yeast will come in little packages, and you just use one of those packages. In my case, I have a big jar of yeast, so the jar will usually say, but 1 package has 2 1/4 teaspoons of yeast. So I'm going to measure up 2 1/4 teaspoons of this. You want to kind of shake the teaspoon so that the yeast doesn't form a little mountain on the top of your spoon. You just want it to be nice and level with the top of the spoon so that you have exactly a teaspoon. So that's 1. I'm going to add it to the water. 2. And then 1/4. You can kind of just eyeball what 1/4 is if you don't have a 1/4 teaspoon measuring spoon. So if it's not totally exact, that's just fine. I'm just taking a little spoon and giving that water and yeast a mix. Now you're going to let the water and yeast mixture sit for about 5 minutes, and what you'll notice, well, you might even notice it right away, but that the yeast starts to change and it starts to get kind of bubbly or foamy. And that's when you'll know it's ready to add to the rest of the mixture. Okay, so while the water and the yeast sits in this jar, we're going to mix the other ingredients. So we will start with 2 cups of flour. So one trick that I learned when I was in junior high, actually, is that it's really important not to press down the flour in your measuring cup. You want to have the flour be nice and kind of fluffy when you put it into the measuring cup and then pour it into your bowl. So one way that you can do that is take a big spoon or another measuring cup or a big scoop like this, dip that into your flour, and then pour from your scoop into your measuring cup and pour it so it goes above the sides of the measuring cup. And then use the back end of a butter knife or some sort of flat tool and level off the flour on your measuring cup. And now you have exactly 1 cup and you haven't pushed down the flour at all, you've just leveled it off. So take that cup of flour and pour it into your bowl, and then you're going to get 1 more cup of flour. Now we've got our 2 cups of flour. We're going to add 1 teaspoon of sugar. Add that to the flour in your big mixing bowl. Now you're going to add your salt. Now this calls for 3/4 of a teaspoon of salt. Pour that into the sugar and flour. Now those are your dry ingredients. So I'm going to take my big spoon and just really simply mix those ingredients together. Now if we take a look at our yeast and water mixture, you can see that things are starting to happen and there's little air bubbles that are starting to form, and it's getting a little bit foamy on the surface of the water. So since we can tell the yeast is pretty much ready to be added, we're going to take our wet ingredients and mix them in with the dry here. We'll start with the olive oil. The recipe calls for 3 tablespoons of olive oil. Now you can just pour that olive oil right into the flour, sugar, salt mixture. That was 1. That's 2. That is 3. Now you just take your water and yeast mixture and you're going to pour that right into the bowl with everything else. Now we've got our dry and our wet ingredients in the bowl. We're going to take our spoon and just mix everything up. So you basically want to make sure all the flour is getting covered in the liquid. Right away it's going to start getting a bit more tricky to mix just because it kind of starts turning into a dough ball right away. So you're going to need to use those muscles to stir it. I'm just going to use my fingers to get this bit of dough off the spoon because we're going to start using our hands now. So something I like to do is just take a tiny bit of oil and just rub it into my hands, because that way the dough doesn't stick quite as easily to my hands. So I'll get the dough off the spoon. If there's a little left, that's okay. You can just put your spoon to the side. Now, I'm going to start by just kind of kneading the dough a little bit right in the bowl with my oily hands. All you really want to do here is pick up one side of the dough and push it into the middle with the heel of your hand. Rotate the bowl a 1/4 turn. Again, grab the end of your dough and push it into the middle. 1/4 turn, grab the end of the dough, push it into the middle. So this is just kind of collecting the dough all together inside the bowl. You should be able to pick it up in your hands like this, and with the oil in your hands it shouldn't be too sticky. Before we knead it, what we're going to do is take a little bit of flour You don't need to measure out the flour here. You're just going to take a tiny bit and sprinkle it onto your work surface. It prevents the dough from sticking to your counter because the dough will get a little sticky as you knead it. Okay, kneading is the last step before you're going to let your dough rise. It's really important to knead your dough because right now it's not very consistent. You can see little clumps sort of flour and oil, and so you need to knead it to make the dough very uniform and consistent throughout. Kneading also helps to activate the gluten in your flour, and it'll allow for those air bubbles to form in your dough. Got our dough down on our floured surface. We're gonna take one end and push it into the middle of the dough. Use the heel of our hand to push it. So rotate the dough, pick this one end up, push it into the middle. Turn the dough, take another end, fold it into the center and push with your hand. So your dough should kind of start to make these nice little folds. When you run out of flour on your table, just take a little bit more, not too much. Brush it, keep going. So now you can already tell the dough is forming into a nice uniform ball, and you might be tempted to stop kneading, but keep going for at least 5 minutes to get your dough ready. Once you have kneaded your dough for about 5 minutes and it's feeling nice and soft, not too sticky, you're gonna put it back into your mixing bowl. What I like to do is line the mixing bowl with a little bit more oil, just about maybe a teaspoon. So put a little oil in there. You can just kind of use your hands to spread it around the bottom of the bowl. And then place your dough in the bowl. I like to give it a little spin to coat it in the oil and then flip it upside down. So you're gonna cover up your bowl. You can use plastic wrap. I just usually use a tea towel. So I'm gonna wash my hands, wash the oil off my hands, and then grab a tea towel, cover it up, and then set a timer for 1 hour. Your dough should double in size, and that's when you'll know it's ready. So 1 hour has passed and our dough has grown a lot. It's really kind of squishy, so when I poke my finger, my fingerprint stays in there. So we know it's nice and full of air. So now that your dough has risen for an hour, you can either package it up and put it into a plastic bag, put it in your fridge and save it for tomorrow. The dough will keep for 1 day ahead of time. Or you can take the dough right now, pull it out of the bowl and form it into the pizza shape that you would like to have for your meal. We're not gonna go into that today because this is the end of the lesson, but I hope that this has given you a really good idea on how to make homemade pizza dough. We mixed the ingredients, we kneaded the dough, we let it rise for 1 hour, and now you're all set to shape the dough, add your ingredients, and put it in the oven. So I hope you have a chance to try this and have fun. See you next time.